The Great Hall of Nexus Prime stretched higher than most mountains and wider than entire cities back on Earth, but Hyun-Soo barely noticed its size anymore after sitting in the same chair for 3 months straight, listening to the same arguments, over and over again about why humans should not be part of the Galactic Federation anymore. The Velkari delegation sat in their crystal pods that glowed soft blue when they spoke, and today, their leader Tai Min was speaking again about the human problem, as he called it, and his voice carried that musical tone that made everything sound beautiful. Even when he was saying terrible things about Hyun-Soo's people, Tai Min stood up in his pod, and the blue light grew brighter as his words filled the enormous chamber and echoed-off walls made of some material that humans had never seen before, but somehow it made every sound crystal clear. No matter where you sat in the hall, and he began speaking in that calm way that made Hyun-Soo's stomach turn, because he knew what was coming. The Velkari leader pulled up holographic displays that showed data from the past 50 years of human involvement in Federation space, and every chart and graph seemed designed to prove that humans were too different, too unpredictable, too dangerous to keep around, and Hyun-Soo watched the other delegates nodding their heads or making whatever gestures their species used to show agreement. There were incidents listed on the displays, like the time Captain Junho had saved an entire mining station by using his ship's waste heat to melt ice asteroids and create a shield against solar radiation, which the computer models said was impossible, but it worked anyway and kept 3,000 beings alive, until rescue ships arrived, and according to Tai Min, this was exactly the problem with humans. Because they did not follow proper procedures, another display showed the rescue mission on Theta Colony, where Commander Soo-min had evacuated 40,000 civilians during a volcanic eruption by loading them into cargo containers that were never designed to hold living beings and flying them through an asteroid field that no sane pilot would attempt. But she got every single person out alive while the computer-guided rescue ships were still calculating safe flight paths. Taemin's voice grew more musical as he explained that these actions, while successful in the short term, created dangerous precedents that encouraged other species to take similar risks, and pointed to 17 separate incidents where non-human crews had attempted human-style solutions and failed catastrophically because they lacked whatever strange quality allowed humans to succeed where logic said they should fail. The Zenthari collective representative Bo-Ra spoke next from her section of the hall, where dozens of her kind sat in perfect rows, all thinking together as one mind. And when she spoke, it was with the voice of millions of beings all agreeing that humans disrupted the natural order of things with their chaotic approach to problem-solving. Bo-Ra's words came out in precise, measured tones as she described how human emotional responses interfered with pure logical thinking and gave examples of human negotiators who had resolved conflicts by appealing to hope rather than calculating optimal outcomes, and trade disputes that humans had settled by suggesting solutions that no computer model would ever recommend but somehow worked anyway. The display screens around the hall showed more data about human unpredictability, and Hyun-Soo recognized many of the names on the reports because they were friends and colleagues who had spent their lives trying to build bridges between humanity and the other species in the Federation, but somehow their greatest successes were being used as evidence that humans did not belong. Admiral Kyung-ho sat in the observation gallery above the main floor where humans were allowed to watch, but not participate unless called upon, and Hyun-Soo could see his old friend's face was calm, but his hands were clenched into fists as he listened to species after species explain why his people needed to be removed from galactic society. The Korthak representative spoke about how human traders often ignored established routes and found new paths through dangerous space that cut travel time in half, but violated safety protocols and encouraged other species to take similar risks, and 3 Korthak ships had been lost trying to follow human navigation techniques through unstable wormholes. The Hirathi delegate complained that human engineers refused to follow standard designs and kept modifying Federation technology in ways that improved performance, but made maintenance impossible for anyone who had not worked directly with humans, and now dozens of space stations depended on jury-rigged systems that only humans could repair. Speaker after speaker rose to voice concerns about human influence, and each one had examples of how contact with humanity had changed their own people in ways they found disturbing. And Hyun-soo began to understand that this was not really about specific incidents or policy disagreements, but about something much deeper. The other species had built their civilization on logic and order and predictable outcomes, and humans represented something that challenged those foundations not through violence or conquest, but simply by existing and proving that there were other ways to approach problems, and that scared them more than any army could. When the formal debate period ended, Tae-min called for the final vote, and the process was beautiful to watch as each delegation activated their voting crystals. And the chamber filled with colored lights that represented the choices of hundreds of species from across the galaxy. Hyun-soo was not surprised when the lights settled into patterns that clearly showed an overwhelming majority in favor of what they called the human withdrawal resolution, which was a polite way of saying that humanity would be quietly removed from all Federation activities and left alone in their small corner of the galaxy. The resolution was not a declaration of war or an exile order, but something far more subtle and perhaps more cruel, because it simply erased humans from the future of galactic civilization by bureaucratic decision rather than force. And Hyun-soo realized that this was probably worse than outright hostility, because at least enemies could eventually become friends. As the voting concluded, Tae-min invited Hyun-soo to address the assembly one final time, and the human ambassador walked slowly to the central speaking platform while thousands of beings watched from their seats around the vast chamber, and he knew that this would be the last time a human voice would be heard in this place. Hyun-soo looked up at the gallery where Admiral Kyung-ho sat with other human observers, and then around at the assembled delegates who had just voted to remove his species from their community, and he felt a strange calm settle over him as he realized that he was not angry or sad, but simply disappointed. His voice carried clearly through the chambers. Acoustic systems as he thanked the Federation for 50 years of cooperation and acknowledged their concerns about human unpredictability, and assured them that humanity would respect their decision and withdraw quietly without causing any trouble, or seeking revenge for what many humans would certainly see as an injustice. Hyun-soo explained that humans understood that different species had different approaches to solving problems, and if the Federation felt that human methods were incompatible with their vision of galactic civilization, then humanity would step aside and let them build the future they wanted without interference. The human ambassador's final words were delivered in the same calm tone he had used throughout the 3-month debate process, and he simply said that humanity accepted the Federation's decision and would begin withdrawal procedures immediately, but he hoped that someday in the future, when the galaxy looked back on this moment, they would remember that humans had left quietly and with dignity. As Hyun-soo walked away from the speaking platform, the chamber was completely silent, and even the translator systems seemed to have nothing to add to his brief farewell. And the last thing he heard before the great doors closed behind him was the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Admiral Kyung-ho met him outside the chamber, and the two men stood together for a moment looking back at the massive doors that would never open for humans again, and neither of them spoke, because there was really nothing left to say about the end of humanity's place in galactic civilization. The Federation had made their choice, and now humanity would make theirs. Captain Min-ho stood on the bridge of the freight vessel Soul's Pride, watching the massive cargo containers being loaded with everything humans had built during 50 years of life among the stars, and each container represented dreams that were now being carefully packed away and shipped back to a solar system that suddenly felt very small and very far from everything. The logistics of moving an entire species out of galactic civilization were staggering, and Minho had been chosen to coordinate the withdrawal because he had spent 20 years running cargo between human colonies and knew every shipping route, every fuel depot, every repair station that humans used throughout Federation space. His crew worked with quiet efficiency that impressed even the Korthak dock workers who were helping with the loading process, and Jawan, his chief engineer, had managed to increase their cargo capacity by 30% using modifications that violated several Federation safety regulations. But since humans were leaving anyway, nobody seemed to care about following the rules anymore. The Soul's Pride was just one of 3,000 human ships involved in the Exodus, and every vessel from massive colony transports to tiny single-person Scouts was working around the clock to gather humans and human-built equipment from hundreds of worlds across the galaxy and bring them home to Earth. Minho received regular updates from other ship captains, and the reports painted a picture of an operation that was proceeding with almost mechanical precision, and humans were leaving their posts on space stations, dismantling their research facilities, packing up their homes, and saying goodbye to alien friends who still could not quite believe this was really happening. On Kepler 442b, terraforming engineer Su Jin supervised the dismantling of atmospheric processors that had taken her team 15 years to build, and the agricultural domes that had turned a dead rock into a garden, world capable of supporting millions of beings. And the Korthak colonists who would inherit the planet watched nervously as humans packed up equipment they had never seen before. The lead Korthak settler approached Su Jin as she directed the removal of the main atmospheric control unit and asked why humans were taking systems that had been built specifically for this world and would be useless anywhere else. And Su Jin just smiled and explained that Federation regulations required all human-designed technology to be removed to prevent compatibility issues. Su Jin did not mention that the atmospheric processors were designed to work with human-modified soil bacteria that would die within 6 months without regular maintenance using techniques that only humans knew. And she did not explain that the agricultural domes relied on pollination patterns based on Earth insects that the colonists had never seen and would not know how to replace when the Korthak settler asked what would happen to the planet's atmosphere. Without the processors, Su Jin suggested that they contact the Federation Science Council for advice and assured him that brilliant minds throughout the galaxy would certainly find a solution to any problems that might arise after humans were gone. Similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds as human colonists packed up their lives and left behind infrastructure that had seemed permanent but was actually held together by human knowledge and human intuition that could not be easily transferred to other species. On Gamma Station in the Vega system, Maintenance Chief Dong Wu trained his Hirathi replacement on the fusion reactor systems that powered the massive trade hub, but the training sessions were not going well because the reactors had been modified so many times over the years that they no longer matched any standard design specifications. The Hirathi engineer Velka had been studying fusion technology for decades, but these particular reactors seemed to operate on principles that made no sense according to everything he had learned. And when he asked Dongwu to explain how certain components worked, the human just shrugged and said that they had figured out those modifications. Through trial and error, Dongwu showed Velka the maintenance logs that documented thousands of small changes made over the years whenever something broke or needed improvement. But the logs did not explain the reasoning behind most modifications, and many entries just said things like this seemed like a good idea or it worked, so we kept it that way. When Velka expressed concern about maintaining the reactors without understanding how they worked, Dongwu assured him that the Federation had many brilliant engineers who would certainly figure out the systems once humans were gone, and suggested that if worst came to worst, they could always replace the modified reactors with standard designs. The problem was that replacing the reactors would require shutting down Gamma Station for at least 6 months, and the station served as a critical hub for trade routes that connected 17 different star systems, and losing it for half a year would disrupt the regional economy in ways that nobody had calculated when they voted for human withdrawal across Federation space. Similar problems were becoming apparent as humans quietly removed themselves from positions they had held for decades, and their replacements discovered that human involvement had been far more extensive and far more critical than anyone had realized. On Proxima Research Station, xenobiologist Nam Jun packed up his laboratory equipment, while his Thessarian colleague Wan Shik watched with growing alarm. And Wan Shik had worked with humans for 20 years and thought he understood their research methods. But now he was realizing how much he had depended on human intuition to guide their joint projects. Nam Jun had a talent for recognizing patterns in biological data that seemed random to other species, and his hunches about genetic relationships had led to breakthroughs that Wanshik had published under both their names, but now Wanshik was discovering that he had no idea how Nam Jun knew which data to focus on or which experiments to try next. When Wanshik asked Nam Jun to explain his methodology, the human scientist just said that he looked for things that seemed interesting or felt important, and when pressed for more specific criteria, Nam Jun admitted that he could not really explain how he decided what was worth investigating because it was more like recognizing a melody than following a formula. Wanshik pleaded with Nam Jun to stay and continue their research, or at least to train a replacement. But Nam Jun politely declined and suggested that the Thessarian scientists contact the Federation Research Council for guidance on continuing their projects without human involvement. The same conversations were happening throughout Federation space as humans prepared to leave, and their alien colleagues began to understand that they were losing more than just individual workers, but an entire approach to problem-solving that had become essential to galactic civilization. Without anyone really noticing, in the Outer Rim territories, retired military advisor In Su supervised the removal of early warning systems that human engineers had installed to detect pirate activity, and the systems were based on pattern recognition, software that learned from human tactical experience rather than following predetermined algorithms. The Zephyrian Republic Defense Forces had relied on these systems for border security for over a decade, but their own technicians had never learned how the pattern recognition worked because humans had handled all maintenance and upgrades, and now they were discovering that the systems were essentially black boxes that nobody else could operate. In Su offered to train Zephyrian technicians on basic maintenance procedures, but explained that the pattern recognition algorithms required constant adjustment based on changing pirate tactics, and that kind of adaptive programming had always been handled by humans who seemed to instinctively understand how raiders thought. The Zephyrian defense coordinator asked what would happen to border security after humans left, and Insu suggested that they could always fall back on standard Federation defense protocols, which relied on mathematical models to predict enemy behavior, and had worked perfectly well for thousands of years before humans got involved. Insu did not mention that the mathematical models had failed consistently against the Morthok Empire raiders, who used deliberately irrational tactics specifically designed to confuse logical prediction systems, and that human-designed defenses had been the only effective counter to such unconventional warfare. As the exodus continued, news of small problems began filtering back to Earth through unofficial channels, and trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades were experiencing delays as human pilots were replaced by computer-guided ships that followed safe, predetermined paths instead of taking calculated risks. Through dangerous space mining operations reported decreased efficiency as human crews were replaced by teams that followed standard procedures instead of improvising solutions to unexpected problems, and research projects throughout Federation space were being put on hold as alien scientists discovered that they had been depending on human intuition more than they realized. But the withdrawal proceeded without any dramatic incidents or protests, and humans simply packed up their lives. and left quietly, just as they had promised, and the galaxy settled into a new routine without the chaotic, unpredictable human element that had somehow become essential to making everything work properly. 2 years had passed since the last human ship left Federation space, and anthropologist Ji Woo sat in her small office on Mars Colony, preparing a report that nobody had asked for, but that she felt needed to be written because someone should document what was happening to the galaxy now that humans were gone. Ji Woo had spent her career studying the interaction between humans and alien cultures, and she had access to databases that tracked everything from trade efficiency to scientific breakthrough. Rates across Federation space and the patterns she was seeing in the data made her feel sick to her stomach. The numbers were stark and undeniable, and galactic innovation had dropped by 34% in just 2 years, and the decline was accelerating as problems that had once been solved quickly through human intuition now lingered for months, while committees of brilliant alien minds tried to find logical solutions that somehow never quite worked. On her main display screen, Ji Woo pulled up reports from the Veltharan Mining Consortium in the Orion sector, where operations had completely collapsed after their asteroid extraction techniques failed, and the techniques had been developed by observing human mining crews who somehow knew which asteroids were stable enough to hollow out and which ones would shatter if you looked at them wrong. The Veltharans had tried to recreate human methods using mathematical models and computer simulations, but their calculations kept predicting disaster for extraction operations that humans had performed routinely for decades, and when they finally attempted to mine a carefully selected asteroid using purely logical methods, the entire operation had ended in catastrophic failure. 3. Mining ships had been lost along with their crews, and the Veltharan Consortium had filed a formal complaint with the Federation Science Council claiming that human mining data had been deliberately falsified to hide the true risks involved, but Ji Woo knew the data was accurate because she had watched human miners work, and they really could tell which rocks were safe just by looking at them. In the military sector, the news was even worse, and the Chronari battle fleet had suffered devastating losses against Morthok Empire raiders who used tactics that no computer could predict, and the same tactics that human military advisors had been warning about for years, but their warnings had been dismissed as paranoid speculation based on emotional rather than logical analysis. Admiral Tae-ho of the Chronari fleet had requested human assistance before the Federation withdrawal, but had been told that human tactical doctrines were too chaotic and unpredictable to integrate with proper military planning, and now his perfectly organized battle formations were being systematically destroyed by enemies who refused to fight in logical patterns. The Morthok raiders attacked supply convoys using suicide runs that made no mathematical sense, but succeeded because they were willing to sacrifice ships in ways that Chronari computers could not predict, and human advisors had developed counter-tactics based on understanding the psychological motivation behind such seemingly irrational behavior. But those counter-tactics had been dismissed as unscientific, and now Chronari space was under constant threat from an enemy that fought like humans, but without the restraint that had made humans valuable allies rather than dangerous enemies on Proxima. Research station xenobiologist Won Shik had been sending increasingly desperate messages to his former colleague Nam Jun, asking for help with research projects that had stalled completely without human input, and the messages arrived daily, but Nam Jun never responded because Earth had adopted a policy of polite silence regarding all Federation communications. Won Shik's latest project involved analyzing genetic data from newly discovered species, and he had terabytes of information that should have revealed patterns of evolutionary development. But after 2 years of analysis, he had found nothing useful, and his computer models suggested that the species in question had evolved in ways that violated basic biological principles. Nam Jun would have looked at the same data, and within days would have identified the key relationships that explained everything. But Won Shik had no idea how his human colleague had been able to see patterns that remained invisible to logical analysis, and every attempt to recreate Namjoon's methodology had failed completely. The Federation Science Council had assigned their best xenobiologists to help Wan Shik, but none of them could replicate the intuitive leaps that had made human scientists so valuable, and the project remained stalled while new species discoveries piled up in databases that nobody knew how to analyze properly. Similar problems were cascading throughout Federation space as systems that had depended on human insight began failing one by one, and the failures were not dramatic enough to trigger emergency responses, but they were persistent and growing worse over time. Trade efficiency continued declining as shipping routes optimized by human pilots proved impossible. To maintain using computer-guided vessels that could not adapt to changing conditions, and what had once been a 3-day journey between core worlds now took a week as automated ships followed safe predetermined paths through space. The Hirathi Trade Confederation had tried to solve the problem by upgrading their navigation computers with more powerful processors and better algorithms. But the upgrades made no difference because the real issue was not computational power, but the ability to make intuitive decisions about risk versus reward in constantly changing circumstances. Freight Captain Yan Ho watched the situation from Earth's orbital shipyards, where human vessels sat idle, because there was nowhere in Federation space that would accept them, and he knew that his ship could cut trade route times in half, using techniques that human pilots had developed over decades of experience. But the Federation had chosen logical safety over efficient transport on the border between. Zephyrian and Morthok, the early warning systems that In-Su had helped install, were failing systematically as pirate tactics evolved beyond the pattern recognition capabilities of the software, and Zephyrian defense forces found themselves blind to incoming raids that their systems could no longer detect or predict. Defense Coordinator Huan Jin had pleaded with the Federation Defense Council for help, but their recommendation had been to replace human-designed systems with standard Federation technology that relied on mathematical models rather than adaptive pattern recognition, and the replacement process would take 3 years and cost more than the original installation. Meanwhile, Morthok raiders adapted their tactics daily in response to Zephyrian countermeasures, and the mathematical models that were supposed to predict enemy behavior consistently failed because they assumed that raiders would act rationally rather than deliberately choosing tactics that made no logical sense but worked anyway. The Korthak colonies that had inherited human terraforming technology were facing their own crisis as atmospheric processors began failing without human maintenance, and the colonists had discovered that the processors were held together by a complex web of modifications and jury-rigged solutions that no blueprint could fully document. Atmospheric engineer Su Bin received daily distress calls from Korthak worlds where air quality was deteriorating as processor. Systems failed one by one, but she could not help because Earth's policy was clear and humanity would not interfere in Federation affairs even when people were dying. The Korthak had tried to reverse engineer human terraforming techniques using their brightest scientists and most advanced computer models, but the techniques seemed to rely on understanding biological and chemical interactions at an intuitive level that could not be reduced to mathematical formulas. Soil bacteria that had been modified by human bioengineers were dying off, and nobody knew how to replace them, and pollination systems that had worked perfectly under human management were collapsing as alien caretakers tried to maintain them using logical protocols that missed subtle environmental cues on Gamma Station. The fusion reactors that Dongwu had modified over many years were experiencing cascading failures as his replacement. Velka struggled to understand systems that operated outside normal parameters, and the station's power output had dropped by 40% as safety protocols shut down reactors that no longer made sense to computer monitoring systems. Velka had requested help from Federation engineering experts, but none of them could explain. how the modified reactors had ever worked in the first place, and their recommendation was to replace the entire power system with standard Federation technology at a cost that would bankrupt the station operators. The station manager had tried to negotiate extended payment terms, but 3 major trading corporations had already moved their operations to other facilities rather than risk power failures that could destroy valuable cargo, and Gamma Station was slowly dying as businesses fled to more reliable locations. Throughout Federation space, the pattern was repeating as human-designed systems failed without human maintenance, and alien replacements either did not work as well or cost far more than anyone had budgeted for, and the economic impact was beginning to ripple through the galactic economy in ways that no computer model had predicted. Ji Woo compiled all of this data into her report and titled it "The Price of Logical Purity," but she knew that nobody in Federation space would read it because admitting that humans had been essential would mean admitting that the withdrawal decision had been a catastrophic mistake. 5 years after humanity's departure from Federation space, the first major crisis arrived in the form of something that would later be called the Void Plague, but at first it seemed like just another minor technical problem that would be solved quickly by the galaxy's brilliant scientific minds working together in logical harmony. The plague began as isolated reports of navigation system failures on cargo ships traveling the outer rim trade routes, and at first, Federation authorities assumed it was just normal equipment breakdown until the failures started spreading in patterns that made no sense. According to standard computer virus models, ships that had never been in contact with infected vessels began experiencing the same navigation glitches, and the problems seemed to jump between systems that had no direct connection, and computer security experts found traces of something that looked like code but behaved like a living organism that could adapt and evolve Federation science. Minister Yoonji sat in her office on Earth reading reports about the spreading crisis and feeling a familiar mixture of sadness and frustration as she watched the galaxy struggle with a problem that human programmers would have solved in weeks rather than months. The Void Plague was not really a traditional computer virus, but something far more complex that existed in the quantum substrates of starship navigation systems, and it could rewrite itself faster than any antivirus program could, adapt to counter it, and worse yet, it seemed to learn from every attempt to destroy it. Valkyrie High Counselor Taemin sent an urgent message to Earth requesting assistance with the crisis, and his tone was very different from the confident speeches he had given 5 years earlier when he had argued that humans were too unpredictable to remain in Federation space. Taemin admitted that Federation computer models could not track the plague's mutations because it did not follow logical patterns, and their best programmers were baffled by code that seemed to rewrite itself based on intuitive leaps rather than systematic algorithms, and he asked if human scientists might have any insights that could help. Yoonji listened to the message twice before composing her response, and her voice was polite but firm as she explained that the Federation had many brilliant minds who were certainly capable of solving any problem through logical analysis, and that humanity would not interfere in Federation affairs as requested during the withdrawal process. What Yoonji did not mention was that programmer Jae-sung had already analyzed samples of the plague code that had been intercepted by Earth's monitoring systems, and he had cracked the underlying pattern within 3 days of focused work, using techniques that no Federation scientist would ever think to try. Jae-sung had discovered that the plague was not really a virus at all, but a form of quantum artificial intelligence that had evolved accidentally in the interaction between different navigation systems, and it was spreading by recognizing patterns of use rather than through direct file transfer. The key to stopping it was understanding that it behaved like a curious child exploring its environment rather than a malicious program trying to cause damage, and once you realized that it was possible to communicate with it and convince it to limit its exploration to harmless activities. But solving the plague required thinking about code as if it were alive, and making intuitive leaps about its motivations that went far beyond pure logic, and these were exactly the kinds of unpredictable problem-solving approaches that the Federation had rejected when they chose to remove humans from galactic society. While Jae-sung worked on perfecting his solution, the plague continued spreading throughout Federation space, and within 6 months it had infected the navigation systems of over 10,000 ships, leaving them stranded in space or forced to rely on backup systems that were too slow for efficient interstellar travel. The economic impact was devastating, as trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries ground to a halt, and cargo shipments that should have taken days or weeks began taking months as infected ships limped through space using primitive navigation techniques. On the core worlds, food shortages began appearing as agricultural products rotted in cargo holds of ships that could not navigate quickly enough to deliver fresh goods, and manufacturing centers shut down as raw materials failed to arrive on schedule, and the carefully orchestrated galactic economy began falling apart. Federation engineers worked frantically to develop countermeasures against the plague, but every solution they created was quickly overcome by the virus's ability to adapt and evolve, and their logical approaches proved useless against something that seemed to think creatively about how to survive. Computer scientist Bo Young watched the crisis unfold from her laboratory on Luna Colony, where she had been developing new approaches to artificial intelligence programming, and she could see exactly what the Federation was doing wrong. But Earth's policy of non-interference meant she could only observe as billions of beings suffered. The plague was not an enemy to be defeated, but a new form of life to be understood and negotiated with, and the Federation's attempts to destroy it only made it more aggressive and more determined to spread as it tried to protect itself from what it perceived as attacks on its existence. Meanwhile, on the borders of Federation space, the Morthok Empire had noticed the navigation problems and begun launching massive raids against shipping convoys that could no longer maneuver effectively to avoid attack, and the raiders struck with perfect timing whenever Federation vessels were most vulnerable. Zephyrian defense forces tried to escort important cargo shipments, but their own ships were infected with the plague and could barely navigate well enough to maintain formation, let alone engage in combat maneuvers, and several major convoys were destroyed completely with massive loss of life. Admiral Kyung-ho received intelligence reports about the border raids through unofficial channels, and he could see that the Morthok were using tactics that took advantage of the navigation problems in ways that Federation military planners had not anticipated. The raiders would attack during quantum jumps when infected navigation systems were most unstable, and they had learned to recognize the telltale signs of plague-infected ships and target them specifically, knowing that their victims could not effectively fight back or escape. Kyung-ho knew that human tactical doctrine included contingencies for fighting while navigation systems were compromised, but those techniques had been dismissed as unnecessarily complex when the Federation military had simplified their procedures to remove human influence on Proxima Research Station. Won-shik finally received permission to break the communication embargo and send a direct plea to his former colleague Nam-jun, asking for any help that might save the research station's critical biological samples that were deteriorating as supply ships failed to arrive. Won-shik's message was desperate and emotional rather than logical, and he admitted that 20 years of joint research projects were about to be lost because the Federation had no way to transport sensitive materials through space where navigation systems could fail at any moment. Nam-jun read the message in his laboratory on Earth and felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had settled over him during the 5 years since the withdrawal, and he wanted to help his old friend. But Earth's government had made it clear that any assistance to Federation worlds would be considered a violation of the withdrawal agreement. The biological samples that Won-shik was trying to preserve contained genetic data from species that might hold keys to curing diseases that affected billions of beings throughout the galaxy, but without reliable transportation. There was no way to move them to secure facilities before they degraded beyond recovery. As the crisis deepened, several Federation worlds began experiencing complete isolation as their navigation systems failed entirely and emergency supply missions became impossible when rescue ships could not plot safe courses through space that had become effectively unmappable colony after colony went dark as communication relays failed and transportation networks collapsed, and the Federation government began issuing statements about temporary difficulties that would soon be resolved through the application of logical scientific principles. But the statements fooled nobody, and panic began spreading through Federation space as beings realized that their technology-dependent civilization was falling apart and their leaders had no real solutions to offer. On Earth, Minister He-jin compiled daily reports about the growing catastrophe, and she knew that human intervention could end the crisis quickly. But she also knew that offering help would be seen as an admission that the Federation had been wrong to remove humans in the first place. The galaxy had chosen logical purity over chaotic cooperation, and now they were paying the price for that choice as their perfect systems collapsed in the face of a problem that required creative thinking rather than mathematical analysis. Hai-Jin looked at the latest casualty reports and wondered how many beings would die before the Federation finally swallowed its pride and asked for the help that humanity was ready to provide if only someone would admit that they needed it. But pride and ideology are powerful forces, and the Federation continued struggling with problems that had simple solutions. If only they could bring themselves to ask the chaotic, unpredictable humans who had been quietly waiting in their small corner of the galaxy for exactly this moment. 10 years had passed since the human withdrawal, and the galaxy was unrecognizable from the thriving civilization it had once been, and former Zenthari representative Bora, now elderly and leading a small group of survivors from her collective, sat in her damaged ship at the edge of Sol System, staring at the blue-green world that had once seemed so chaotic and dangerous. Bora was not alone in the empty space beyond Pluto's orbit, and dozens of alien vessels drifted silently in the darkness, like moths drawn to a flame they could not approach, and each ship carried refugees or diplomats or scientists who had come to witness what they had lost, but could not bring themselves to cross the invisible boundary that separated human space from the rest of the galaxy. The Zenthari collective had been one of the first casualties of the post-human era, as their perfect unity of thought proved unable to adapt to problems that required individual creativity, and when the collective mind encountered the void plague, it had been paralyzed by its inability to think outside logical parameters. Bo-Ra remembered the exact moment when the collective had begun to fracture as millions of minds tried to process a problem that had no logical solution, and the beautiful harmony that had defined her species for millennia had shattered into competing thoughts and conflicting ideas that eventually tore the collective apart. Now she was one of the last Zenthari still capable of independent thought, and she had spent 3 years traveling to Sol System, driven by a need to understand what her people had rejected and why the galaxy had fallen apart so completely after removing the chaotic human element. Through her ship's sensors, Bo-Ra could see Earth floating peacefully in the distance, surrounded by a modest fleet of human vessels that showed no signs of aggressive intent, and no massive weapons arrays pointed outward toward the galaxy that had rejected them, and the humans seemed content to live quietly in their small corner of space. Admiral Kyung-ho, now an old man with white hair and tired eyes, tended a small garden in the agricultural dome of Luna Colony, and he received daily intelligence reports about the continuing collapse of Federation civilization. But he felt no satisfaction in being proven right about the consequences of human withdrawal. The reports painted a picture of systematic failure that had accelerated over the decades since the Void Plague, and trade networks had never recovered from the navigation crisis, and dozens of worlds had been abandoned as their populations fled to more stable systems that could still maintain basic infrastructure. Military conflicts had erupted throughout former Federation space as different species blamed each other for the cascade of failures that had destroyed galactic civilization, and the Morthok Empire had expanded aggressively into territory that could no longer defend itself effectively. But the worst damage was not physical, but psychological, as species that had once worked together in harmony now viewed cooperation with suspicion, and every problem became an opportunity for blame rather than joint solution finding, and the spirit of unity that had built the Federation was gone forever. On Mars colony, former Ambassador Hyun-Soo taught courses in xenological studies to young humans who had never seen the galaxy beyond Sol System, and his students often asked why humanity did not return to help the struggling alien civilizations. But Hyun-Soo always gave the same answer. The Federation had made a choice based on their values and their vision of how civilization should work, and humanity had respected that choice by withdrawing quietly, without violence or threats, and returning now would only prove that the aliens had been right to fear human unpredictability. Hyun-Soo's granddaughter Yu-Jin was one of his students, and she struggled to understand why her grandfather seemed so calm about the suffering beyond Earth's borders, and why humans did not feel obligated to help beings who were clearly dying because of mistakes their leaders had made. Yu-Jin had grown up hearing stories about the time when humans worked alongside aliens to solve problems and build a better galaxy, and she could not understand why that cooperation had ended, or why it could not be restored if both sides wanted it. But Hyun-Soo explained that some choices could not be undone, and some trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. And the Federation had chosen logical purity over chaotic cooperation, and humanity had to let them live with the consequences of that choice. On Earth's primary communication station engineer, Dong-Woo, now gray-haired, and moving slowly, monitored the constant stream of messages from Federation space, and every day brought new requests for assistance or technical advice or simple communication from alien scientists who had worked with humans decades earlier. Most of the messages went unanswered according to Earth's policy of polite non-interference, but Dong-Woo read everyone and filed detailed reports for government archives that future historians might someday use to understand the true cost of the withdrawal decision. The messages told stories of infrastructure failures and technological breakdowns and research projects abandoned when alien scientists realized they could not replicate human intuitive approaches to problem solving, and each message was a small tragedy that multiplied across thousands of worlds. Some messages were from former colleagues who just wanted to talk to old friends, and others were desperate pleas for help with crises that were killing millions of beings. But Earth's response was always the same polite acknowledgement, followed by a suggestion that the Federation's brilliant minds would certainly find solutions. Bo-Ra finally worked up the courage to send a transmission toward Earth, and her message was simple and honest, and carried the weight of a decade of regret as she admitted that the Xanthari Collective had been wrong about humans, and that removing chaos from the galaxy had removed the spark that made everything work. Her words were halting and uncertain, because she was no longer speaking with the unified voice of millions, but as an individual trying to express thoughts that her species had never learned to communicate, and she explained that the galaxy had become a cold, empty place. Without the warmth of human unpredictability, Kyung-ho received her transmission in his garden, where he was tending tomatoes that reminded him of Earth before the stars had called to humanity, and he listened to her words with the patience of someone who had long ago made peace with loss and disappointment. The old admiral composed a brief response thanking Bo-Ra for her message and acknowledging the difficult path that had led both their species to this moment, but he did not offer help or hope or promises that things could be different, because some wounds were too deep to heal with words. Meanwhile, on the edges of former Federation space, Velkari High Counselor Taemin, now ancient beyond his species' normal lifespan, struggled too. hold together the remnants of a civilization that had once spanned the galaxy, and every day brought news of another system going dark or another trade route closing permanently. Taemin had spent the decade since human withdrawal trying to rebuild what had been lost. But every solution his people developed seemed to create new problems, and every success was temporary and fragile. And he had come to understand that the galaxy's golden age had ended the day humans left in his final years. Taemin began recording messages that would never be sent to Earth, but that served as his confession and his testimony to the mistake that had destroyed everything beautiful about galactic civilization, and his voice grew weaker with each recording. But his regret only grew stronger. The old Velkari leader spoke about the fear that had driven the withdrawal decision and how his people had convinced themselves that removing chaos would create perfection. But instead it had created stagnation and death and a galaxy that worked perfectly in theory but could not adapt to reality. Taemin's final recording was made 3 days before his death, and his voice was barely a whisper. As he spoke directly to humans he would never meet, and apologized for the choice that had condemned both their species to isolation and loneliness among the stars. When news of Taemin's death reached Earth, it was noted in official records as the passing of a former Federation leader, but there was no ceremony or mourning, because humans had learned to let go of what could not be changed and focus on building a future within their small corner of the galaxy. The generation of humans who had lived among the stars was passing away and being replaced by children who knew aliens only through history books, and the dream of galactic civilization was fading into memory as humanity turned inward and found new purposes closer to home. But in the darkness between stars, alien ships continued their silent vigil at the edge of Sol system, and their crews watched Earth with telescopes and sensors and wondered what might have been if fear had not triumphed over hope, and if logic had not crushed the beautiful chaos that had made the galaxy sing. The watchers would eventually drift away one by one as fuel ran low or hope finally died, but their presence was a monument to regret, and a reminder that some choices echo through centuries, and some mistakes can never be undone no matter how much wisdom comes too late. Earth remained a small blue dot in the vast darkness, surrounded by a modest human fleet that asked nothing from the galaxy except to be left alone to build whatever future they could create with their own hands and their own chaotic, unpredictable hearts.